Hello, and welcome to another episode of Strange Dominions podcast. I'm your host, Octavian Graves. Tonight we have a very, very special episode. One that I have been really excited to record pretty much all year. Honestly, once I heard about the project, I really could not wait to get him on and interview him. So, tonight, that's right, I and special guest host Luke Bell are interviewing David Rankine about his new series, the Grimoire Encyclopedia Volumes 1 and 2. We speak on the methods of finding all of the grimoires included, some of the experiences that went into creating the Grimoire Encyclopedia, and then we just sort of riff and talk about grimoires, magic, demons, fairies, and some of David's own experiences and how they relate to Luke's. As always, if you've seen something strange or unusual, such as a cryptid, spirit, or UFO, please get in touch with us, as we would love to have you on the show. We are, again, doing a lot of guest interviews and witness interviews, especially witness interviews. We really, really want people who've seen weird things. Well, as for right now, I'm your host, and this is Strange Dominions. Here is the episode. All right, we are here with Luke Bell, teacher and magician, and the wonderful and esteemed David Rankine. David, welcome to the show. We are very excited to have you.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So I've been thinking about this interview a lot and how I was going to go about it. And the one thing that I kind of got stuck on was sort of an introduction to you about us and what we're about. And, we've been doing this show now for almost 2 years. And central theme of the show really is how magic and the paranormal work and how they intermingle and how they connect. But the bigger thing about this show is it reaches out to the kind of person that they just don't get those kind of flashy results or those phenomena that they hear about all the time. And they can't quite tap into that sort of really supernatural aspect of magic, but they keep trying. And I've been probably more honest than I'd like to about my trials and tribulations in magic and things like that. But the reason why I got so into grimoire magic specifically is because Luke here was my first and really only true mentor in the art. And he was the only person that whenever I spoke to about magic, most people would just say, oh, well, I can't really tell you about that. There aren't any really instructions. You just kind of have to figure it out. You're on your own. And Luke was the first person to tell me that there's a system that if you follow the rules and you do exactly as you're supposed to, then you will get the result that you are looking for. And so that is how, I ended up doing all this research and all these shows on grimoire magic. And I think this really hits on why these Grimoire Encyclopedias are so valuable, because they really go beyond what most books do on this subject. And I just want to thank you so much for writing these, because I think they're going to be valuable to many, many magicians for their entire lives, at least I hope.
Yeah, I mean, that's my hope too. When I put them together, it was really trying to put something out there that would be good as a resource for people, putting information together, but also signposting where they can go to find out more on any particular grimoire as well. There's a lot of people out there doing really good work, and I wanted to highlight the work that's being done by so many magicians now, that to encourage people to go and see what is going on. If you want this particular grimoire, then you can see, oh, there's such and such a book by so-and-so and that, and this book by another person. I'll go and read these books and find out more. And so people can get a better grasp before they sort of dive into that grimoire, as it were.
Absolutely. And it really speaks for itself and how valuable it is. So the first real question I have for you is, what methods did you use to compile all these grimoires and find them and really dig into the individual history of each of them?
Initially, I started off with the 30 or so, which I mentioned in the introduction. I'd written a little bit about for an old friend back in 2010. And I started making a list of all the grimoires I thought should be in there. And as I was doing, the list was getting bigger and bigger. And I decided that 100 was a good place to stop, or it could just go on forever. And some of those were, there's a couple of titles there I'd never heard of before that I found during the research. And I've been fortunate that in the past, for many years, I worked self-employed. I was writing books, I was editing and proofreading other people's books. And so I literally spent a good few years of my life in the British Library, 5 days a week, in the rare books and manuscripts collections, going to other places like the Wellcome, the Bodleian in Oxford, and other places, tracking down manuscripts. So it's just a process that unfolded over many years. And by the time I sort of had the idea that I should get this book written, there was already a huge amount of stuff in place for me to draw on and sort of bring together and work on to create the book.
Definitely worse places to be spending years of your life than the British Library trawling through these manuscripts, though, I think, hey?
Yeah. Funnily enough, as we're talking about the whole thing of the intersection of magic and the paranormal, I used to go there Monday to Friday every week. And I was living in West London, and I'd get the tube into King's Cross and then 5-minute walk to the British Library before when it opened at 10 o'clock. And one morning, I had my laptop in its bag, and I was opening the front door to leave, and a voice said to me, "Don't go today." It was like one of the spirits I work with. And I said, okay, I went back. I went back in, set my laptop back up, put the radio on, and that was the day of the 11/11 bombings. And the train that got bombed was the one that I would have been on. The timing of that is the time that I would always got off at King's Cross on that line. So I probably would have been on that train that got bombed if my spirit hadn't said, "Don't go today." So a good example of how the spirits you work with can watch out for you.
It was the Piccadilly line, I think, wasn't it? If memory serves, that goes straight through King's Cross and Pancras. That's incredible. Although that does speak to a bigger subject there, David, as to where, and I've certainly had this in my own research over the years, where the spirits that you work with start to point you towards things that will aid in your praxis and things that you could find useful and easier ways to call them their history. They do seem to have this very kind of like tutelatory, some of them anyway, element to them if you've worked closely with them. Have you ever found that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's spirits, you develop a relationship. It's, there's a definite symbiotic relationship there. It's akin to a friendship in a lot of respects, in that mutual respect in the way that you engage with the spirit does, like you say, you can make the process a lot simpler. I was talking about this the other day, about how whilst you have this big preparation to do your initial conjuration to a spirit, once you've actually developed a relationship with it, the contact methods can be a lot simpler and quicker. You don't have to do a whole week's preparation and big circle and conjuration necessarily. It can become a much simpler process of working with spirits because that familiarity is there.
Without a doubt. And if I could ask you feel free to not answer this, David, because I know some people would rather not. Whenever I've conjured a spirit and they've been bonded, and one of the things that you're always advised to ask is another method of calling them that doesn't involve all of the pomp and circumstance of a full Solomonic operation. And I've quite often found that those things have come across when I've got that information as being sounding very kind of cunning folky, very folk magic-y, lighting a candle with certain herbs and certain oils under a certain phase of the moon, under a certain day, things like that. And I wonder what your view is on the idea of cunning folk magic being a continuum of the Solomonic tradition, in that these methods could have been passed down orally from master to student through witches and cunning folk, and they kind of just lost the inception of that spirit contact, which was the Solomonic tradition. Because quite often people see a duality between folk magic and what some people call high magic, and I wonder where you kind of stand on that point.
okay, this is one that takes that's in quite a few branches here. I mean, as you know, I've written more than one book about cunning folk and books of practice. And yeah, I think the key thing with cunning folk is they had to do magic that worked, because
Right.
that was how they got paid. They wanted stuff that worked, and their books tended to record the things that worked repeatedly for them. You know, a cunning man's book will often have next to little things probatum est. It is proven. You know, that's
Yeah.
yeah, this is a good one. And so from that perspective, they were using definitely stuff from the grimoires, but also, like you say, simpler folk magic. And I think absolutely would have a situation where they would develop relationships with the spirits which went, enabled simpler contact of the sort you described. You know, what you were saying parallels very much some of the contact methods I've been given. So
Interesting.
I would definitely agree with you on that. And further to that, there is also, if you are teaching somebody, that it's possible to introduce somebody to a spirit that you have that familiarity with, let's say, because, you know, in a sense, they do become like familiar spirits. They are spirits that you are familiar with, that the contact could be passed on to somebody that you train. So the same simpler methods could be used without necessarily needing that initial complex conjuration. It's like the same way as if you and I were met at an event, and a mutual friend might say, David, this is Luke. Luke, this is David, and introduce us. And that was just like a simple introduction. But from there, the contact can develop. It's, you know, I think a similar thing can be true. There's something, as you say, that I think has largely been lost. You know, cunning folk were effective practicing magicians. If they weren't effective, they gave it up and did other jobs. And there are records of people doing that as well. But if they were good at what they did, then those are the ones whose books of practice obviously tend to be the most interesting, because if that stuff was working well for them, there's a good chance that, you know, you can practice it and get it to work for you as well.
Well, absolutely. I heard Stephen Skinner give a very good example on I think it was on the Glitch Bottle, and Dr. Skinner was talking about his experiences living in Asia and just the universality of magic there and its kind of wider acceptance without the cynical materialism that the post-industrial Western world has. And he said that, I think he described it as the bomos and the magicians in that part of the world will say that if they are to kind of screw people over, for want of a better term, and not get them the results that they want, they're breaking their rice bowl. They're destroying their opportunity to feed their family. So they would rather just give a refund on someone who didn't get the result from the working that they were supposed to do, which I found to be very pragmatic approach to something that people don't often view as particularly practical.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. It's very interesting talking to Stephen about this stuff, because that whole Eastern thing, likewise with the spirits, you know, that a Bomo or a sorcerer in that part of the world, you know, has like a book of spirits. They're only the spirits they've actually worked with, that they have the connections with. They don't list stuff that's not part of their practice. Right. And I think that's what people forget about a lot of things like the cunning books of practice, and even to an extent the grimoires. The reason why the grimoires are fragmentary is because often people were recording things they needed to remember, stuff they knew off pat, they didn't necessarily need to put in the grimoire. So, you know, there's often chunks missing that you think, oh, well, this grimoire is incomplete because it doesn't tell you how to do this or that. Well, that's because the person who wrote it knew how to do this and that and didn't feel they needed to record it. They're recording things like spirit lists or other stuff that they might not, you know, absolutely remember, and so want to sort of have it recorded so that they can refer to it at any time.
Sure. Have you, further to that point, have you found in your practice that there have been, obviously no need to name them, but particular spirits that have acted in a lot more of an ambassadorial way to introduce you to other spirits that could potentially help you with certain things that maybe weren't within their office?
I have, although some of that is not strictly speaking within grimoires, but within another tradition that I practice. But yes, and this takes us into another sort of interesting area where a spirit introduces you to a spirit that you don't find in any of the books.
Yes.
They're not listed. There's no, this is this spirit who does this and this, whose name is this. It's a name, you know, you look it up and it's like, well, can't find this one anywhere. But, you know, they seem to be quite effective at what they do, and they're fine with having a relationship. in some ways, I find those spirits to be really interesting and actually exciting to engage with, because it's really unfamiliar territory when you're working with a spirit that's not one that there's any record of. So you don't know if they've worked with people before even, or who they've worked with, but you're developing a relationship with a spirit based on that introduction from a spirit who you've worked with and trusted. So, you're assuming, okay, let's see where this goes.
That's so interesting that you've had that experience. I've had something similar specifically when working the Goetia. I've found that the chief spirits that you have in the 72 that everybody knows, that it seems that they seem to have servile spirits that work beneath them as well. And the further you get down the hierarchy, the more specialized each one of those spirits becomes at a certain area of the overall office. I don't know if that's anything similar to what you've experienced, but that has been my experience with working with some of the Goetia spirits in the past.
Absolutely, and not just with Goetia, with others as well. I mean, the major spirits in the grimoires usually have a whole load of sort of spirits under them who, it's like it's in a business, isn't it? If you've got like a company, your spirit in the Goetia or other grimoire will often be kind of like the president of the company, and then they've got ranks of people beneath working for them. And as you go down, the tasks do become more specialized. From your top layers of management tend to be telling people what to do. Your lower levels of management, the ones doing all the different tasks that make the business run. It's the same sort of principle.
Very interesting, fascinating. It's always nice to hear these things coming from an experienced magician such as yourself, where it kind of really validates things that you've experienced in the past. I like when there's those crossovers, when everybody's had a very similar experience to another. It's always quite a fun thing to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really enjoy talking with people and finding out their experiences, particularly if it's like they're working with grimoires that I've not really got experience of, to sort of see how that compares as well, because often it can be just some little thing that somebody says gives you that light bulb moment for,
yeah,
that's something else that I could add in or try. I love that cross-fertilization that comes when you sort of get practicing magicians together talking about stuff.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of one of the cruxes of grimoire research, maybe, and obviously that has its implications on practical magic itself as well, is the detective that you have to be in order to, whenever people have asked me where to begin when practicing magic, the only advice I've ever given them is read as many grimoires as you possibly can, because there's not any of them that are fully and truly complete. And if you can read the Goetia and then read the Book of Oberon and then read the Grimoire in Verum, and there are little pieces in there that you'll find in some and not in others. And it's interesting to kind of go, I wonder if I add this into my praxis when I'm doing a Goetia operation, this thing that I found in the Book of Oberon, what happens then? And quite often I've found that it augments it in a very effective way. And that's I think that really, which is a nice bookend to that, is one of the really fantastic things about the utility of the Grimoire Encyclopedia, is that it's all in one place. And I'd imagine it's going to save a lot of people a lot of time and, frankly, agony.
I mean, I hope so. And when I was writing the practice chapter, I actually kind of wrote at the end, because I thought I really want to put something in that has some flavour of how I like to do stuff. So, and that thing, exactly as you say, I try and make the point that because most of grimoires are fragmentary, I'm a great believer in being competent and fluid in the mechanics of a system before you change it. But at the same time, because it's fragmentary, I wouldn't take something out. You can totally enhance it by adding stuff in, like you said. So, for example, the blessing or consecration of the scryer is not something you're going to find in pretty much any of the grimoires, bar the original place. But I do that for all of them because, for me, it adds to the ritual. And so there's elements that I add in, regardless of which of the grimoires it is, because for me, they add to the magical momentum. They increase the chance of success of it going, all according to plan and how you want it to.
Couldn't agree more. And a similar thing I took from, obviously there's a little more of a direct lineage there when working with like the Lucidarium or the Heptameron, and it's almost direct descendant being the Goetia, and especially with some of the conjurations. And you do see flavors of this in the Goetia of Dr. Rudd with the 72 corresponding thwarting angels, but calling to the angel of the day on the day that you are practicing, doing the invocation to the angel of the day, I've found has been incredibly helpful in ensuring a higher rate of success in conjuring the more chthonic spirits, because it's a step that's kind of missed out in the Goetia, but it's very present in the Heptameron.
Yeah, I mean, as time went by, it became quite simplified. You see this, the style of, like you say, the Heptameron Lucidarum. There was earlier very Swanbook, much more heavily angelic magic, through to the much more demonic French stuff a few hundred years later. It's been pared back and simplified a lot, and both work. It's like you are getting a different flavor with the choices you make on sort of what style of grimoire you want to work with.
For sure. And it does seem that correct me if I'm wrong, it does seem that there are some things that just universally make whatever spirit you're working with make an operation more effective. Presumably the same goes with the consecration of the scryer as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's you'll have your basic checklist of all the things that you want to, that need to be done. The consecrations, your circle, and the preparation. It's like a whole. And I tried to give that as a sequence for me, what I feel are all the things that are good to have there in that practice chapter, so that for people coming to it who didn't have much experience or any maybe experience of conjuration, hopefully they would find that helpful. That's like based on my sort of 40 plus years of doing grimoire magic. I was trying to put in like the hints and tips of things that I find work really well, or that just aren't recorded, because you're not going to pick up a medieval grimoire and it say to you, oh, whenever you see a cross in the text, you should make the sign of the cross as you're saying the conjuration, or to activate your magic circle, you need to do this. It's not just an inert thing on the ground. There's things which aren't there that people do need to know.
Yeah. And then that's, again, incredibly useful. And I think you've helped a whole generation of fledgling magicians by actually putting that stuff down, because it is such a, I know when I started 15 or so years ago, it was such just a swamp of information, and the problem is there's so much bad information out there as well, right? And there's still very much that very Victorian hangover of like psychological magic being a thing, and the idea of demons being part of the subconscious or angels being part of the subconscious, and that you're supposed to view these things in the astral and you can project a circle with your mind and all of that kind of stuff. And for those people that are looking for the kind of results that people like us are looking for, and the kind of results that the authors of these grimoires were getting, that's probably not going to cut the mustard.
No, not at all. Crowley did nobody any favors with his initial comments on the Goetia, and he was a bit enamored of Freud at the time, I think, and this idea that they're psychological and parts of the psyche. Someone says that to me, that's kind of ends the conversation, really. It's like, well, if you think that, there's not really any point in us talking about this, because I know from direct experience that these spirits have their own unique being separate from me. They are not a part of me, unless you get into the whole concept that we're all a part of a greater whole, which is not really relevant from the point of view of doing conjuration.
No, it's a much larger philosophical discussion to have, isn't it? But it's funny you say that, actually. I lent a friend of mine a copy of the Goetia recently, and it was the Mother's edition, and it has the foreword by Crowley in it. He says, so where shall I start reading from? I said, well, you can probably just skip that whole foreword because it's going to give you a lot of bad ideas that aren't going to be very helpful to you if this is something that you want to actually practically use.
Yeah, I mean, Mother's, again, it's like a two-edged sword. He did these translations which were so important in opening things up, like the Key of Solomon. He transcribed the Goetia. He did that incomplete French Abramelin. He did the Grimoire of Armadale. But it's like, for some reason, he never picked the best copies of the manuscripts. Like the Abramelin, he did that incomplete French version. There's like much more extensive, the original German texts. And it's funny because by the time Crowley was doing the Abramelin, he was in contact with people like in Germany who knew about the full Abramelin.
Yeah.
I mean, I was quite surprised when I was doing the research. I thought there were a few copies. I didn't realize there was like more than a dozen different Abramelin manuscripts scattered around. It's like, but it was crazy the number of copies of some of the manuscripts I was finding when I was doing the research for the book. It's like, blew my mind. It's like, well, there's no one there, and there's oh, there's another two there, and oh my god, it was just. And that's something else I was trying to do is like put all the information there, so if someone wants to focus on a particular grimoire, they can find out where all the sources are as well and go back. I'm a great believer in going back to source as much as possible.
Mm. Yeah, and people like yourself and Dr. Skinner and particularly as well Joe Peterson as well have done such a great service to everyone. I mean, I spend so much time on Joe Peterson's website just looking at the sources that he's managed to find, because like you say, if you're looking to do something properly, you got to go back to where it came from, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Joe, I kind of sort of joke about like Joe being like, if there was one, like the modern patron saint of the grimoires, because he's done so much for the grimoire community, and his scholarship is so excellent that any book he puts out, you want to buy.
Of course.
But it's also a really good example of there's a very positive fraternity amongst grimoire magicians in that there's been times where a couple of times, for example, when Steve and I were doing Clavis Inferni, that took us ages to work out because it was a cipher manuscript and there was various different magical languages, and there's bits that were in contracted reversed Latin and stuff. And there was like one, I think, magical symbol we couldn't work out, and I contacted Joe, and he was able to say, "Oh yeah, such and such," and he's incredibly helpful to people. Serious practitioners talk to each other and share stuff, and that's something you don't see in some of the magical traditions. But I think there is much more of a sense of, well, I'm happy to share because anything that expands the tradition is good.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. When you were looking through I imagine you went through myriad manuscripts and books when you were writing the encyclopedia, David. Did you come across any manuscripts that maybe things you hadn't really been in your orbit before that you kind of set a fire off and you said, well, I'd really like to work this grimoire and I haven't? Were there any examples of that at all?
There's a couple in there that I was like, I hadn't seen before, and at least one of them hasn't been sort of actually published yet. So that's something that maybe I would like to get around to in the future, but it's all a case of time. And certainly there's stuff in it. I think it's in English and Old English and Latin, and the writing is not great, so it's going to take a while to transcribe and translate that one. But there's some bits in there that I was thinking, yeah, I would like to give that a go. But because I'm working on a book at the moment, and then after that, I'd kind of like to do volume 3 of the Grimoire Encyclopedia, and then maybe I'll get to that other grimoire, because there's a lot of stuff that I think could be added in to further expand what I put in the first 2 volumes of it. The plan wasn't that was the end. That was like sort of getting what I've done up to that stage out there, and there's more things that I want to add in to expand it further, to make it more of a corpus of material for people.
I mean, that brings up an interesting question. Where does this end, David? Like you say, with such a large corpus of material out there, you could be doing volumes until your last day of the Grimoire Encyclopedia. Surely, is there a finite point that you have? Would you plan for this to be like a living project that just carries on the deeper you go into your research?
I think more like a living project. It's something I intend to continue on with for many years. Like I say, I know what I'm going to put in volume 3. I've got some thoughts of what I could put in a later volume after that. I mean, there's already, for example, 20 or so grimoires I'd like to put chapters in volume 3, as well as some other completely new sections of stuff that I think would add to things for people. And some point further down the line, second edition, so I can add in all the other things that have been published since, or any new stuff that's come out regarding the ones that were already in there. So yeah, I kind of see this as being my magnum opus and my life's work from here on with the Grimoire Encyclopedia. There's quite a few other books I'll want to write as well in between, but the Grimoire Encyclopedia is going to be, I think, the sort of dominating theme of my life here onwards, from the point of view of my writing.
Well, I mean, that makes me ecstatic to hear. Obviously, it's a lot of work for yourself. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that there's plenty of people out there that are really, really happy to hear that. That's great. That's great news. Octavian, I'm really sorry. I feel like I kind of derailed your line of
Not at all. This has been very valuable just for me listening. So no, please keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of reached the end of my line of inquiry there. I was kind of handing off to you for a second.
Yeah, well, so the next question I had One of the co-hosts that I was going to have on was an astrologer friend of mine. And so I wanted to ask you about astrology and how you felt about astrology in the grimoires, and if it's important throughout the entire history, or if there are certain aspects of the grimoire history where astrology is more prominent and less so in others.
I think astrology is one of the really important aspects of the grimoires, absolutely, but not just the astrology of, like, the 12 signs and 7 planets that people would think of, but also the 36 decans, which kind of harks back to ancient Egypt, where you had like gods and spirits for each of the 36 decans, and you see that carrying through the mansions of the moon, the 28 mansions of the moon, which we see coming into the grimoires from sort of Arabic magic, but the Arabs got it from the Greeks, who got it from India. So the mansions of the moon originally are an Indian concept that sort of comes in, and that's something I mentioned in a footnote, I think, in the Grimoire Encyclopedia, that things like the Indian influence into the grimoires is something that's still not really been touched upon and needs more work. But from the point of view of a lot of the spirits do have particular connections to planets, astrological signs, decans, etc. So they're working with appropriate timings, again, greatly increases your that are relevant for that spirit, will greatly increase your chance of having a successful conjuration and encounter with that spirit. And the astrology is there, I think, pretty much all the way through. There's places where it sort of seems to fade away, but that's more individual grimoires, I think, than periods of time. It's something that's kind of there throughout the whole grimoire period, from sort of about the 12th century on.
Absolutely. Agree. And bounce off of that, kind of go into like the 7 classical planets and the spirits that are assigned to each one. One thing I found really interesting, a grimoire that I'm very interested in, is the Arbitel. Is it kind of instructs you to look at your own astrological chart and see what your dominating planet is and work with the spirit of that planet. And so for me, my sun sign is Scorpio, and going from the classical 7 planets, that would be Mars. But my conundrum has always been that I don't exhibit any martial attributes in my personality or life, or I have no interest in many martial things. I have no interest in becoming a police officer or in the military. I was curious about, when, either for you or just in your opinion, do you find that working with spirits that are in the planetary alignment of your astrological sun sign or something like that, do you find that there is a stronger bond, or does it really not matter?
I think that there can be an easier affinity, but that doesn't mean that should be the way you should go. I'm glad you brought up the Olympic spirits, because this kind of touches on something would be further on in the questions, I think, which is, I think the Olympic spirits and the planetary intelligences are the best spirits to start working with when you do the grimoires, because they tend to be, A, the most amenable, and B, the conjuration process for them is simpler than, for example, goetic conjuration. And definitely, I don't think it's an essential. I mean, I'm a Leo, so you go, okay, solar. So, you're going to pick your solar spirits to work with, but my chart actually has a lot of Mercury and other stuff in it. So, and I tend to be more drawn to mercurial spirits. So I think you can work with any. I think there's just a natural sort of leg up, as it were, working with the ones that you have that affinity with from your chart.
Absolutely. And I would definitely agree with you, because while I don't really have many martial attributes in my personality or my outlook on life, I definitely have an interest in mercurial things and things like that, as well as solar things. So that would definitely be my area of interest as well.
So I think it's important that people don't get hung up on, I can only work with, the spirits that are my natural affinity like that, because often the ones that aren't your natural affinity are the ones that you might develop more valuable relationships with. I won't say many decades, but it's a few decades ago now. When I studied astrology, the person who taught me, when we were sort of doing casting charts, I said, never consider the things like squares and what have you as negative aspects of squares or oppositions. They're challenges to be overcome, and they're often show you like the areas of weakness that you need to work on. So from that perspective, I think having a spirit that might not be the one that you would naturally be drawn to by your chart, you might end up getting a lot more from working with that spirit.
Very interesting. Very interested to know your thoughts on, because obviously there's huge amounts of emphasis in a lot of the grimoires on the phases of the moon and favorable days to do conjuration within them, specifically the Goetia. I mean, I will keep going back to that as a frame of reference because it's the one I'm personally most familiar with. But the Goetia talks about performing these operations usually within the waxing of the moon. I have personally found that whilst I've had plenty of contacts with spirits during those phases, I've also had some really quite visceral contacts with spirits during the waning and dark moons as well, which is kind of antithetical to what the grimoire instructs. And later down the line, I was actually talking to Adley Nichols, and he informed me that there within the Summa Sacra Magica there are also favorable days in the waxing moon and the dark moon for conjuration as well. How important have you found lunar cycles to be in your personal praxis?
I think going back to what we were saying earlier, the waxing does tend to lend itself more, and so you're adding more to the momentum. But once the contact is there, I think any phase of the moon can work for you. And it's a case of all the other factors that you factor in as well. In the same way as I'm a great lover of planetary hours, for example, and using appropriate hours where possible. But if you're doing a conjuration, often the conjuration is going to last longer than the planetary hour itself. But for me, what's important there is that the conjuration starts in the planetary hour, even if it runs over into the next planetary hour. We have to accept that timings aren't always going to be perfect or as you want. And sometimes you need to do stuff at particular times, and it might not be the optimum time. So you try and optimize everything else around it. So, yeah, I think the lunar is certainly important at the beginning, but as your contact with the spirit waxes, it becomes easier to work with it when the moon is waning.
Interesting. So you think that the significance of that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the significance of that is more for the initial contact of the spirit than it is the ongoing maintenance of that relationship?
Yeah, I think that's more factor for that big initial contact introduction.
Gotcha. Very interesting. Thank you. I appreciate your thoughts on that.
One of the things that we've been talking a lot about is relationships with spirits. And one of my questions was about the bond of spirits, but I feel like a more accurate question would be, as I've been working in this show and talking to contemporaries within the occult community, the subject of spirit bindings is a very hot topic and a very controversial topic. And I feel like a lot of that has to do with people not quite understanding what we're talking about in terms of Solomonic magic and the binding of spirits. And I'm curious, David, what your opinion is on that and why that is such a hot topic. And if there's a better way to explain it to people so that we understand that when we say binding of spirits, we're not saying that we say a bunch of words and then chains come up and that spirit is then held in place in pain and agony.
Yeah, I mean, the nature of the triangle that the crystal or the mirror in kind of sums up. So I think rather than binding, constraining might be a better word, because, as you say, I mean, I have never had to do, when I haven't done Goetic stuff for a long time. I've been working in other grimoires in more recent years, but I did do a lot of Goetic stuff in the past. I never once had to do the curse stuff that's in the Goetia, for example. I've never had to do that side of things. So that constraint is more setting up an environment that you can have a contact with them in. So it's not a hostile thing, it's not a domination thing, it's actually part of the setup process, that they manifest in that crystal or that mirror. And you can think of it, if you're going, the idea of like a full manifestation of a spirit, is incredibly rare. People think, oh yeah, spirits in the smoke and all that. That doesn't really tend to happen very, it's not to say that spirits don't manifest. I have seen spirits manifest. I've done, for example, conjuration for hygromantia of one of the demons of the day, where you call on the planetary god, then the angel of the day and the demon of the day, and it manifests in the fire, and there was a humanoid shape in the fire, and the dozen or so people are there, quite a few of them were rather freaked out. But if you're using that crystal or mirror in a triangle or a circle, whichever it may be, or even a pentagram, depending on what type of spirit you're doing the conjuration for, you are creating a gateway, an interface between you and them. It's almost like a magical Zoom call, in a sense, like we're doing now. Because if you're trying to get it to manifest into this realm, the grimoires often say they can only stay for an hour, then they've got to go. They're uncomfortable. It's not their natural place. It's a bit like a fish out of water. It's going to start to drown quite quickly. Likewise, some of the spirits become uncomfortable in our realm. Whereas if you are communicating through that gateway, that crystal or that mirror, you can have a contact, an engagement that lasts much more than an hour if it's required, because they're quite comfortable in their realm, sitting at home, as we are in our circle. Like I said, like using that analogy, a Zoom call. So yeah, I think bond is a loaded term, and people do tend to misrepresent it. And also sometimes people confuse bond with pact, which is a whole different thing entirely.
Absolutely, right? Yeah.
So yeah, for me, it's not a bonding of the spirit. It's a constraining the environment so that it's a suitable interface between you and the spirit that you're conjuring.
And to further that, do you feel that the spirit contract, do you feel that's necessary for any spirit you work with, or other spirits that, really don't need that and you can sort of take them at their word? Or do you feel that it really is something that's necessary with any kind of spiritual interaction?
I have personal spirits there was not a big spirit contract with, and I do not feel that it is an essential. I think it depends on the nature of the spirits. With some, I think you do have to be careful and have almost that legalese terminology, because they might not, on initial contact, be that positive or helpful. And so, you're setting boundaries to prevent harm, because at the end of the day, they're not all sweetness and light. So even a spirit that is initially hostile may become more positive, and you can develop a good relationship with when it sees that the encounters are done with respect and that they're not one-sided, and that there's a give and take there in the relationship.
That's an interesting point there, David, as well. And it's one that I think a lot of people overlook at the start of their magical practice, is that the spirits, like anything else, have personalities and natures that are maybe wider umbrella personalities for certain types of spirits. I think everybody goes back to the passage that Iamblichus wrote about, where he was very likely describing demons at the time in De Mysteries, and angels can be said to have certain things that are universal to all of them. But further to that, there are individual personalities that each of them have, depending on their associations and characteristics. The thing I wanted to ask you about was, since obviously when you look at books like particularly the 72 spirits in the Goetia, you look at them and say, well, these are all categorized as demons, and that they're unholy and unclean spirits, they're fallen angels. But when you actually start working with them and you actually have contact, more to the point, with some of them, you start to realize that there are fairly blaring differences in the way that a lot of them behave. Do you feel that the list of those 72 there are, calling them demons is maybe just an arbitrary umbrella term? Because it would seem that it's possible that there are smaller demigods, fairies. I certainly think some of them are definitely what most people would consider to be demons. And Beleth and Malphas are two that spring immediately to mind from personal experience. But do you feel that there are maybe other types of entities that have just been lumped into that spirit register?
Yeah, I would totally agree with you on that, Luke, that there are some which are far more benevolent, pretty much from the word go, that you can develop a positive relationship with. And I mean, one of those spirits I worked with, and I hadn't actually done that much with, but I went and somebody did some unfortunate things against myself, and the spirit went and screwed them over quite badly without me asking, then came back and said, oh, by the way, I've done this. And I said, oh, thank you very much. Was there something you'd like me to do in return that's within the boundaries of what's reasonable? And our relationship developed from there. But that spirit acted independently without me asking it, which was interesting, and without me having a really strong relationship with it. So, yeah, I mean, the fact that the spirits do have this independent existence and may have their own agendas, desires, and plans is something that we shouldn't forget when we're working with them, because essentially, if they develop a positive relationship with us, then we will be, as they are assisting us to further our goals, so we are assisting them to further their own.
That is crazy, because I've had an almost identical experience with a spirit from the Goetia that did something very, very similar. Maybe a little more enthusiastic than I would have liked this person's
Yes.
fortune to be. But I think you have to remember that what a spirit considers to be an inconvenience to a human is very different than what a human considers to be an inconvenience to a human. But all that is to say, the person was fine at the end of it. They were just in a little bit of a bad way for quite some time. But this particular spirit I'm talking about is one that is, if you actually read their description in the Lesser Key, their office is very nasty and could be considered evil, but I've found them to be such a benevolent and very amiable entity, which is really strange that it kind of betrays the office that they look over. Whereas I think I mentioned another spirit before whose office is to do with inflaming love between two people, and that is possibly one of the scariest things I've ever encountered. It's so strange how the two can be so dichotomous.
Yeah, absolutely. I find it fascinating that those things we have to remember are not gospel. We can't read a grimoire and take it as absolute truth. We follow the practices, but those descriptions that are written by that person with spirit define that spirit as, or give the totality of that spirit.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really good point. And also as well, I would imagine that there is, to some degree, a level of how you approach that spirit and you personally, your personal interactions and maintenance of that relationship will probably change the way that they respond to you, just like any other kind of interpersonal interaction that you might have. So there's being completely reliant on somebody else's experience there is in parts to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, this spirit in question, I won't say which one, but it's one of the crow spirits, let's say that. And
Right.
At the time, my partner of the time and I had found a baby crow on my doorstep, and we took it in, we hand-reared the crow, taught it to fly, and then released it back, and it went and I think reconnected with the rest of the crows that lived in the sort of trees nearby. But at the time, I did think, I couldn't help but think, I wonder if this spirit, which has this crow affinity from the description of how it appears, saw me choosing to seeing that baby crow and going, I've always loved crows. I'm going to sort of like rear you and make sure you're good and healthy and can go back out into the wild. Whereas a lot of people might have just left it to die or done some, not taken care of a crow. And so that's thought, okay, this person is showing that they care about crows, so I'm going to do this for them.
I also have a very big affinity to crows. I actually have one. I had a similar experience with not rearing one, but I had one that used to visit me quite frequently when I lived back in England. We have a lot of them in the Pacific Northwest of Canada, which is where I live now. But I had a similar experience with something. I hope you don't mind me sharing, if that's okay. I have incredible arachnophobia. I am terrified of spiders. But after a particular contact with a certain spirit, I would see spiders everywhere. And anyone that was pertaining to the situation with which I'd asked their assistance started to see spiders everywhere. And I thought this was really strange, and I thought it could be a coincidence. And then I recommended working with this spirit to a friend of mine in a completely different part of the continent. And I said to her, let me know what happens when you do. And she did the conjuration and she got the result that she wanted. And she called me the next day and she said, just out of curiosity, when you work with this spirit, would spiders, did they come up at all? And my jaw just completely hit the floor, because there was nothing in the grimoire that said anything about spiders having any kind of correspondence to this particular spirit. And I found that so strange that someone else had that experience. And it happened a number of times after that to the point where to my great horror, I can no longer kill a spider. I'll have to just release it outside of the house. But interestingly enough, Ian, who was supposed to be who I'm kind of filling in for today with Octavian, we went down a little bit of a rabbit hole and found that there could be a link between this Goetia spirit and deity from the ancient Greek pantheon that does have a very, very solid link with spiders. And so it was such an interesting little rabbit hole to go down, but also interesting that it seems that some of these spirits have a fondness for certain creatures or certain things in nature that they seem to have some dominion over.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the corvids, your crows, ravens, magpies, etc., are very intelligent birds. So I think it's not at all surprising that there would be that spirit connection so heavily, and other spirits as well, with other types of creatures. I'm just referring to the corvids because they are a particular passion of mine. I love crows and magpies.
And you see their correspond. Just, I mean, they've been part of the very kind of pop culture view of magic and magicians, but there's always that they're such ominous creatures and they're so mysterious, right? That they've had their place beside magicians for time immemorial. I think even if you look at other cultures, that specifically the indigenous American culture, there's the crows and ravens have such a high place in their cosmology and their proximity to the spirit world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Hugin and Munin in the Norse, you can go, the Morrigan and etc. in the Irish, we can go all over the place with that one, but too much tangent there.
Yeah, for sure.
Before I mention my story and how my biggest observation is how much of magic sort of rides the wave within nature to get things done. We're at an hour. Do you guys want to keep going, or is this a good place to stop? I just want to make sure everyone's schedule is not conflicting.
Well, I'm happy to go for at least another half hour. I'm really enjoying the conversation, and it seems it would be a shame to cut it off now.
As am I. Luke?
Oh, no, I'm absolutely fine. All I've got to do is really mundane stuff that I'm honestly trying to procrastinate my way out of at the moment. So this is a very, very happy alternative to that. I'm very much enjoying myself.
Perfect. Well, so as Luke knows and the listeners know, my matron goddess is Hecate, who originally I had no real knowledge of. When I was really getting into magic, my area of interest was the Norse pagan gods, because I have some heritage within that realm. But when I would attempt to reach out to them, I really got no response. And then, funny enough, during Luke's original run of online Solomonic classes was where I did the first Headless Rite. And that night I had this very strange dream with Hecate, and then I start experiencing all these synchronicities with her. And, now I'm a full-fledged devotee of her. But a couple months ago, back, I guess, August, I was at a crossroads that I've had a numerous amount of strange occurrences at while doing offerings and things like that. And I was out there doing an offering, and I just sort of asked, basically, I know you're there, but if you could just give me sort of a more concrete sign, that'd be really great. And as soon as I laid down that offering, this crossroads is in a very, very residential area, not very wooded at all, but all of a sudden, from behind me, I just hear something very, very large running at me. And out of the darkness comes the biggest buck I've ever seen. I'm in Maryland. We don't have elk here, but I mean, that's how big this thing really was. And it came up to about 4 feet in front of me and then veered off into the brush and scared the absolute daylights out of me. But it was probably the most confirming experience I've ever had as far as things listening and responding when asked.
Yeah, I mean, Hecate is she's very good for that, isn't she? I mean, I have a big fondness for Hecate. One of the books I wrote, Hecate Liminal Rites.
One of my favorites, one of my standard going to for any kind of historical information for her.
Because back in the early 80s, the first magical lodge I was in, there was somebody else asked if I could do a ritual with them for Hecate. I was like 18 at the time, and I said sure. And we went out in the night, walked out into the country, saw a shooting star, saw a second shooting star, saw a third shooting star. I went, okay, time to stop. And then we looked and realized we'd just come to a freeway crossroads. And then he started reciting the Orphic hymns and things. And the idea was, I was going to sort of be the scryer or seer. I said, Hecate kind of rose out of the ground and possessed me. So the first spirit possession I ever experienced was being possessed by Hecate. It was kind of, this blew my head somewhat. And my friend asked various questions, which she answered, and he was very happy about what she told him and the instructions she gave him. So since then, she's always been there in some way. When I did the ritual from the Hygromantia I mentioned, that was on a Monday, where in the Hygromantia you would work with Selene. There's like Greek god.
Yeah, of course.
I felt there was enough of cross-fertilization of Selene and Hecate that instead I would call on Hecate. So I called on Hecate, and then, but people who might not be familiar with Hygromantia, there's an angel and a demon for every hour of every day of the week. So it's 144 of them. So then I called on the planetary angel of the hour and then the planetary demon of the hour. And boom, that demon came in space, like I say, manifested in the fire. And there's this humanoid flame shape in the fire. And I think a lot of that was down to the fact that Hecate was the deity that I had first called on to be sort of overseeing, and to, that her power was the power behind what was going on for that conjuration. So yeah, Hecate, and the way she has risen in the last 20 years, her influence, and she's become one of the sort of, I think, most significant of the ancient deities in sort of modern paganism.
Absolutely. And that brings me to a good point, and something I wanted to ask you about. There's a lot of ideas about the Goetia spirits, or just grimoire spirits, originally being pagan gods and then demoted by Christianity into these demons that we summon. And I don't know, Jack Rails, who's a friend of both Luke and I and the show, and he just put out his new edition of Hecatian, and he has things in there for basically using Hecate to work with goetic spirits. And I'm curious what your opinion is on sort of diverting from the traditional Judeo-Christian system in favor of a more pagan style to contact these sublunar and chthonic spirits.
I mean, I certainly think it's, a valid way to do it. Jake Stratton Kent was really pioneered that a lot with his work, with Geosophia and his other books. He did amazing work there, and books like Hygromantia do show that there is a valid way of doing things. If you have the experience and it's the right spirits, I think it's a perfectly valid way to go. I mean, the whole grimoire period, it's that thing of magic takes on the religion and the technology of the age. And it was largely a Christian age, but its roots are from a pagan time, the stuff that's in the grimoires. So I think it is perfectly valid. And I mean, if you're working, Hecate, Hermes, Hades, for example, is a really good triad of deities to work with, or this sort of work with some of the grimoire spirits.
Absolutely.
Hermes is another deity who I'm very passionate about, like Hecate.
Yeah, as am I.
So yeah, absolutely. I think it is valid, but I think people coming into it new, it's better to start within the framework that's there with the grimoires, and when they have more experience, then start, shifting over to that if it's their preference with working with those other gods and goddesses.
Yes, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And that's something that when I was getting into grimoire stuff, I had a lot of people who questioned my authenticity with it, just because they knew that throughout my entire life, I've been highly critical of the monotheistic systems. I come from what I would call a culturally Jewish family, but the religion was just not there or talked about and things like that. And it took me about a couple weeks to grapple with that, but I was able to overcome that and find a lot of beauty within the Judeo-Christian system when it comes to grimoires and magic specifically. So I definitely think that if you're going to be getting into this, it's good to start from what is written and then kind of expand out with experience.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are sort of leaning in that direction. And people who are experienced, there are some people who are now writing more about that and going particularly back more to the Goes and the ancient Greek practices, where obviously there was no Christian theology and it was deities like Hecate. So I think that's one of the areas we're going to see grimoire practice expand a lot more in coming years.
Well, it's interesting as well, isn't it, David? Because, like, I mean, there's actual precedent for that as well, right? Like the Greek magical papyri and the Hygromantia, they sit on that very interesting intersection between what was at the time the fairly new Judeo-Christian faith and Gnosticism and Hermeticism, and on top of that, the incorporation of all of the old gods as well, and it begs the question in magical practice as to, you know, whether two things can be true at the same time. Because it seems like we all take a fairly objective view on the existence of these spirits, that they are indeed real and that they're not figments of the imagination or areas of the psychology like Crowley might have suggested. So it begs a lot of very interesting questions about these things, but particularly with Hecate, as you say, there's huge precedent to her being the driving force behind lesser spirits. Just some of the rites within the Greek magical papyri of her essentially encouraging and galvanizing spirits of the dead to go and find you a lover or to inflame somebody for you. You know, these things are fairly normal. So you would think that if you extrapolate that idea, that could definitely be used as a driving force behind a goetic operation.
Absolutely. And I mean, interesting, you know, Steve Savedow's most recent book, The True and Secret Pneumatology, you know, it's like a German grimoire, 17th century, I think. And interesting, at the beginning of that, there's like a Latin Hecate prayer, and that's for dealing with treasure spirits.
And that book just arrived for me, and I'm really, really enjoying it. I'm very excited to have him on the show to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great book. I mean, Steve contacted me and asked my opinion. Like, we went over the translation of the Latin together and bounced it backwards and forwards to try and come up with the best version. And he was like showing me the text when he was working on it. And I sort of asked him, this has to go into the Grimoire Encyclopedia, because when he first contacted me about it, that was a grimoire I hadn't seen before. We were talking about, stuff that was new to me. And I was like, Steve, I love this. Can I put it in? Obviously you'll be credited appropriately and stuff, but I would really like to make this one of the 100 titles. And he was like, yeah, of course. And there's some really exciting material in it. And a good example of the diversity of the grimoires as well. And something Luke said I just want to jump back to, the PGM, that the sorcerer or sorceress whose material is in the PGM, it's sort of like earlier cunning folk. They're doing the magic with spirits that work.
Yes.
So, they're not worried about which pamphlet it's from if they can get results with that spirit. It's like, it's much more of an eclectic, practical attitude to these things. Yeah, I'll work with you if you can get me the results. That's fine by me.
That's just it. And it's crazy how it's always been one of the most interesting. I think it's such a pedestrian thing for me to say because it's so blaringly obvious to anyone that's been involved in practical magic. But the importance of the PGM and just how interesting it is as a document, reading through it and seeing that it is just the working notes of a magician, which is essentially what any cunning man's grimoire or cunning woman's grimoire would have been. Is just it doesn't really matter what your faith or your creed is. It's well, it turns out Anubis can do this for me, so I'm going to keep going back to him, because I need to get paid. So I love that pragmatism and that practicality around magic, and I love that how that just reinforces what true magic is supposed to be, in causing physical and visible change by the intervention of spiritual creatures.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Anubis. Anubis is my patron deity, and another example there, in ancient Egypt, Anubis basically is in charge of the spirits in the underworld. He's got thousands of spirits under him. So, another very good option for working with spirits.
Very interesting. If I might, I'd like to just pivot the line of inquiry ever so slightly, because I recently listened to and re-listened to on numerous occasions your interview on What Magic Is This for their Fistful of Fairies series. And the Fae folk are my most recent, I would say, interest, but definitely bordering on obsession. And Octavian and I recently recorded an episode for this very same show specifically on the Fae. And would you be happy to talk a little bit about your experiences with them and how that relates to their nature compared to other spirits?
Yeah, sure. Anything in particular, or?
Well, yeah. I remember a particular story that you told about performing the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram in the forest,
Yeah.
and being encountered by a very disgruntled fairy queen. Was your intention when you were going out to do that operation? Was your intention to contact the fairy?
No, not at all.
Really
No,
interesting.
no, I was just planning on doing a ritual out in the woods, and that was when I learned that several important lessons. Number one being the pentagram ritual is totally an indoor ritual because it's the equivalent of, you're just basically blasting the space out, getting rid of any spirit that's there. So it's kind of like the equivalent of going into somebody's home, pointing a gun at them and saying, sod off. If you go into and then somebody's got a bigger gun and they go, no, you sod off. And that was that fairy queen. Nothing I did could touch it. I was literally paralyzed from the head down. I was just thinking, I am in deep crap now, racking my brain. What do you do to placate fairies? And while she was just sort of like hovering there, sort of sang and recited poems for half an hour before she then sort of gave like a little nod, and then I wasn't paralyzed anymore and just drifted off. And I was just like, good reminder, there's always things out there that are a lot bigger and stronger than you are, and it's a good idea not to piss them off. That also inspired me to come up with something which, sometimes something seems so obvious and you think, why hasn't it been done? Until it gets done. And so because I do like the pentagram ritual, it's something that was part, I used to do daily for many, many years. I thought about, you have the license to depart, at the end of a conjuration. Mm-hmm. So then I created the license to remain that you do before something like the pentagram ritual, where you give license to remain to any spirit that lives in or has been invited into the place where you're doing that pentagram ritual.
How on earth has that not been done before? That's a really good point. I would never have even thought of that. That's incredible. That's such a cool thing to hear. I mean, this is, just to be completely transparent here, this is very much a selfish line of inquiry here, because I am headfirst in the fairy world at the moment, and I've found that their proximity to us seems to be so much more. How can I put this? They just seem to be so much closer to us than perhaps demons and angels are. And it's very unlikely that you're going to stumble through somewhere and encounter a demon. But I live essentially at the foothills of a mountain range, and spend a lot of time in the forest. And it's not uncommon to come across some very strange things out in the woods, or hear singing voices in the middle of the night and things like that. And I was talking to a friend of mine back in she lives in Scotland, and she's a cunning woman herself, and has had various experiences with what she believes to be the fae folk. And she said, if you want to start, well, the premise of this story actually was that I started having a dream about what I thought to be a fairy woman handing me a flute and teaching me a song. And I called her about that. And she said that what she would advise to do is to go out into the woods every day and play this song on a flute and see what happens. And so that's what I've been doing for the past week or so. And I don't know what the end goal of that is, but the being really interested in the Book of Oberon at the moment and contact with the fae folk, it seems to be that maybe that's the starting point. I don't know, or maybe I'm just wasting my time. That's also possible.
I would absolutely go along with what she said. Personally, I would add to that whenever I went out and played the song, there's classic foods to give them, and I would lay out a little feast for her as offerings to facilitate that contact as well.
It's good advice. And so that's the other thing. That's I'm working on an offering table at the moment to take out. As you say, I think a lot of the things that are prescribed, like finely cooked chickens and bread and sweet things and good wine, but it can't be left on the floor. It has to be put on a table, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, on the table, and then at the end, it can then, after you go, you can leave on the floor for the animals and things to eat, because at the end of the day, the offerings, are there to go back into nature, and those sort of fairy nature spirits have a much more immediacy to us, like you say, than angels and demons. They are much more contactable for that reason, and we also have to be extremely careful for that reason, because they can be incredibly powerful, and there's like that's where, studying fairy lore and like knowing the things to avoid doing when encountering them is always a good thing. Not saying thank you, for example,
Yeah.
is a good one. Wearing a hagstone is always a good plan as well to avoid being glamoured. There's so many little things there. I mean, I do find the fairy stuff fascinating, and I've had a number of fairy encounters. I've seen people being fairy led. I've seen a fairy gate on a couple of occasions. I was really tempted to go through one time, but it's not long after the birth of my son back 15, 16 years ago. And the fact that he was back at home was the thing that stopped me. Otherwise, I would have gone for it, seeing what was on the other side. But
Wow, that's incredible. I've heard that also, because I think you're absolutely right. I think reading a lot of the old fairy folk stories and fairy tales, as they're called, is actually strangely a really useful resource for finding out information that maybe isn't included in the grimoires. And there are obviously a lot of cautionary tales with the fairies, and like you say, not saying thank you, and also not saying I'm sorry is one that I came across as well. That you're supposed to just beg their pardon for something and not actually say the word sorry to them. But
yeah.
I think even things that people don't consider to be like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, I've always considered that to be a very fairy thing for someone to do. If someone reneges on a deal to just, lead their children off by music into the mountains, that's a very fairy thing to do. But it does, like the way what you said earlier on about the goetic full manifestations of demons, for example, being quite rare and also a very difficult thing to achieve. It can take a number of hours for that to occur. It does seem, from what I've heard, again, I'm going from a friend of mine's and a couple of my own experiences with the Fae, that they are a lot more likely to actually just appear and seem very, very corporeal comparative to angels and demons. Is that something that you've noticed as well, David?
Yeah, absolutely. And also having the power to do things like affect the localized weather around you. They are have a lot more control of the environment that you are in when you're out there with them, and so you are not in the dominant position generally with them. So yeah, it's good to know as much as you can about their rules and ways of doing things and being respectful. I've seen somebody be disrespectful and they got severely trashed by the forest. They came out of that they were fairy led. They'd been told, as many years ago, a group I was in, we were working at a site that was known to be a dark fairy site, and the member of the group who lived nearby said, look, don't take any iron. This is the thing we sometimes have with fairies and iron. They really don't like it. Everybody who did a check beforehand, no iron, no clothes had zips, and even bras with bra clips in. No iron, apart from the one guy who insisted on taking his dagger, and they were not happy. We all went off and did things, and we were sort of regathering, and then we heard the fairy mimicking our name, our voices, calling him from other parts of the woods, leading him off, and we could see like green lights, like balls of light in amongst the trees. And when he did eventually manage to escape from the woods to us, literally every tree branch had whacked him in the face. He'd tripped over so many tree roots. He was covered in cuts and bruises because he had disrespected them in their place. And that's just an example of, he went through an hour or so of hell trying to get out because he had disrespected one of their rules.
Well, I mean, and that's an incredible story. But it sounds honestly like he got off quite lightly for that.
Yeah.
It's like in the woods near where I live, there are grizzly bears and there are wolves and there are coyotes and things like that. If the fairy wanted to teach you a lesson, they could do so in a very, very, very nasty way in the untamable kind of like mountainous areas, And I wondered, just going back to the concept we were talking about times and augmenting rituals, it's kind of a twofold question that I've got for you, David. Whenever you've done fairy workings before, have they tended to be from like the Folger manuscript, from the Book of Oberon and things that are very focused on that, or have you used other rituals that you found useful and respectful to contact them? Because I don't know that I would personally like to try and bind a fairy in the same way that I would a Goetia spirit.
Yeah, no, it was before I'd encountered the Book of Oberon, and yeah, it was definitely a lot more respectful without any attempt to bind them. Yeah, absolutely.
So it was a kind of like a ritual that you guys had written specifically to contact the fairies, I'm guessing then.
Yeah, it was sort of drawing on things from sort of classical sort of stories and from grimoire things, from for like working with the Seven Sisters, for example, where we had their names and we sort of would call, but not in a way that was demanding. It
Right.
was requesting.
Like an invitation more than a
Come to the feast, please.
Right, gotcha. Yeah, I think that's probably the wiser approach to take with them for sure. And I wondered with regards to timing and things, there's the big thing in fairy lore is the changing of the courts between the Seelie and the Unseelie court, right? That Samhain specifically seems to denote a time in which those two courts change.
And Beltane, yeah.
And Beltane, of course, yeah. And there is a reputation for the Unseelie who rule over the latter part of the fall and the winter leading up to spring being a little more prickly than the spring and summertime courts of fairies, the Seelie court. Have you ever found that to be the case? Would you think it unwise possibly to attempt contact with the fairies during the darker months?
I think my experience, I'd say they're quicker to take offense, but that's the main distinction. Apart from that, I've actually probably had more contact with Unseelie than Seelie.
Oh, interesting.
Myself, because I have gone in very carefully and politely, I have not had problems. Other people who I've been in a group with at those times have not showed the same respect. And not just that one instance, there's been other times, and have had problems. So yeah, they are, I think, definitely quicker to take offence. They're of a similar magnitude. And so I've always been more drawn to sort of dark stuff than light stuff. I think a lot of us who get into magic are. So from that point of view, obviously the Unseelie are kind of fascinating.
For sure. And I've also heard that they're more, and again, I'm going on advice from someone I trust greatly, but who has had more experience than I on the subject. I've had a few encounters during ritual with fairy that have been really quite visceral in that the results that I had asked them for and exchanged an offering for came so quickly, rapidly, and with such unmistakable force that there was no question that it was them that did it. And I've heard that the Unseelie courts seem to have a reputation for just getting things done very, very quickly.
Yeah, I would agree with that, absolutely. They're not quite all the bells and whistles in the same way as the Seelie court, I think. They're very much more, it's get it done, no messing.
Which is
just
great.
Hope you know what you wanted.
Yeah, exactly, because it's coming one way or another. That's fascinating. I really appreciate your insight on that, David. It's really, really interesting to talk to somebody who's had, because the fairy have been such a strange part of magic. Everybody very much focuses on the angels and the demons and the necromantic spirits, but they've been so present in magic for so long, and yet they're so spoken of so little. I find maybe up until now, I think they're making a little more of a vogue these days. But would you agree? Would you think that's a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I just hope that more people who are getting interested in them now will look at the right sources and treat them with the right respect and not think of them as some sort of like fluffy Victorian flower fairy.
Yeah, it's a mistake you might only make once, I think.
Yeah.
I remember back in 2020 when the pandemic was still a thing. A friend of mine and we used to perform rituals and rites together quite a lot. We did so in the clearing of the woods nearby us, and we didn't see anything other than a kind of vague humanoid shadow wandering around the circle, but did hear a very, very distinct voice. And very androgynous, couldn't quite tell if it was male or female. We didn't realize at the time, but there was a really tragic spate of people committing suicide in that particular woods. And this particular fairy, she voiced her disgust at that being a thing. She was quite unhappy about that. And we'd asked her for something and she delivered it very quick, something very material, delivered it very, very quickly. But then we proceeded to be chased out of the woods by a pack of rabid coyotes for a good few kilometers, which was a really hair-raising experience. So that it's interesting how it seemed that her patience was kind of at its wit's end with the humankind at the time. See what I mean?
Wow, this is weird. Problem. And that was our interview with David Rankine. Amazing guest, really fun to talk to, really knowledgeable and very, very well spoken. Cannot wait to have him on again. Really enjoyed talking to him. More guests to come, more content to come. Gonna try and do some more on-site shows. But with that, this is Strange Dominions. But as for now, that's tonight, and we will see you again on the Strange Dominions. Goodbye.